Okay, everybody. I'm going to get us started so we don't eat into the speaker's time. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the final plenary session of this conference and to our final keynote speaker. So I'm going to introduce you to Professor Sarah Grobelaar, and I'm going to have to read her bio because she's got far too many degrees and things for me to remember. So Sarah is a professor at the Department of Industrial Engineering at Stellenbosch University and also a research associate at the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at Stellenbosch University. She is highly effective at developing research partnerships and research programs focusing on innovation for inclusive development. She's initiated and secured major grants and research partnerships with various companies and funders such as global pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the CSIR, and various private companies that operate in the healthcare sector. She holds an MPhil in Technology Policy from University of Cambridge, a Bachelor of Engineering from the University of Pretoria, a Master's in Engineering from University of Pretoria, a PhD in Engineering from University of Pretoria, and a postgraduate diploma in Monitoring and Evaluation from Stellenbosch University. So thank you, Sarah. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Leanne. What a pleasure it is to have an opportunity to share some of my work with this community. So I'm not going to present the agenda slide. Everybody's always grateful about that. So we all know that the world we live in is really not very fair. I could see it again when I was making my drive from Stellies to Cape Town, and you can just see the enormous inequalities that we have in our communities and in our society. So if you are born as a poor child in a township area, the chances are very good that you'll have to attend a school that's not necessarily as good as the richer kids' schools are. The chances are that you will not have the same kind of opportunities to join the mainstream economy. And the chances are that you will end up being poor as well is really, really good. And we all know South Africa's, or we regularly hear the indicators around inequality, especially the Gini indicator, and South Africa is actually one of the most unequal society in the world. Of course, this is not only a South African problem. It can be seen across many parts of the world, especially developing countries. And one indicator is that 50% of the world's wealth is only in 1% of people's hands. So there's an enormous inequality in distribution of wealth. And poor people suffer many other unfair things in life. So when we look at the poverty penalty or double jeopardy, it means that a poor person may have to incur higher costs to get services or products. So it can happen that you stand in a long queue at the clinic for going a whole days of pay because you can't go to work, you need to go to the clinic. And when you get to the front of the queue, the medicines may not be there, stock out, or the medicine you receive could even have expired. And that may lead to non-access and non-usage. So you're not even going to bother to stand in the queue and get your medicines because it's not going to be there. It's going to take all day. So people forego all kinds of services and products because it's just more expensive and of worse quality than somebody who is richer and have access to alternatives. There's also what we call a catastrophic spending burden. So it can happen then when you're poor, you have to spend money on transport to go to work. There's inflation everywhere. And food becomes a discretionary expense. Some people can't eat because they have to go and get to work and put their kids in school. And I mean, these things create even worse conditions for everybody. It's very, very, very unfair. Now, I'm not sure if you have heard of the book, The Fortune at the Base of the Pyramid, or the bottom of the pyramid initially, and later on that term was changed to the bottom of the pyramid. And it initially looked at poor people as a potential market. But very soon we discovered that, or researchers in the area discovered that very few business models actually accommodate penetration. So if you're going to package, let's say, sorry, I forgot to switch on my stopwatch, but anyway, let's say you want to package shampoo in small sachets. Yes, sure, that could be a method to sell your product in smaller quantities to people who don't have a lot of money at that moment. But many, many other things cannot be really packaged in small packages. And these kind of things have very poor penetration rates. Now, I was hugely influenced by Professor Ori Rip. He's a professor at Twente University in the Netherlands, and he was one of the biggest contributors in the area of transitions. So how do we transition from systems that are very unsustainable towards systems that are sustainable? And of course, in Europe, they focus on the environment more. But in a developing country like South Africa, we have social concerns. So what we look at is how can we help poor people? How can we leverage what we've got? And the idea of the grand societal experiment is that in a country like South Africa, we've got a very strong financial sector, we've got good universities, we've got lots of innovative companies, multinationals operating here. And how can we leverage what we've got to drive more inclusive development and growth? And that is basically what we try to look at in our program. Now, the idea innovation for inclusive development goes by many names, and not all of them mean exactly the same thing. So using the word inclusive innovation sometimes creates huge confusion, especially when I speak to policymakers or government people. They think everybody should have been invited to the meeting. That's not what we're meaning. We want to talk about how do we create or use innovation to improve living conditions, the creation of employment opportunities for the poor. And how can we do that by creating new products, services, processes, and business models? So though the conceptualization of inclusion in the process may be how we frame problems, the whole process that we go through to implement innovation, the adoption and absorption of innovation, and then, of course, economic inclusion. Now, there are different terms, like I've said. There's frugal innovation, social innovation, innovation for inclusive development, Hugard innovation, but we focus more on the inclusive innovation side. Frugal innovation would, for instance, be Jaipur Food. It is a prosthesis that was developed in India. Normally, a prosthesis will be about $5,000. This one costs $5. So it's a product stripped of all kinds of features, but provides a basic feature. Of course, it has lots of problems when you do that. It can have hip problems and things, but at least there's a solution. What we are looking at is more how can we include poor people and give them access to healthcare, to food and education. That is what we focus on in our program. I'm giving you two examples. There's the social franchising program called Unjani Clinics, and their innovation is that they set up clinics in a community. It's a privately owned clinic, and the nurse who owns it operates the clinic. And they provide services to a market where people don't have medical aid, but they can afford a clinic visit. And the idea is to decant the pressure on the public healthcare system through this mechanism. And it's inclusive because it's providing a job to the nurse who's from that environment, and it provides access to healthcare so we can improve the living conditions of poor people. Then there's another example, the stock visibility system. I've worked with Professor Jan van Vuren on some of a few OR applications as well in this case. But this is an initiative where clinics that don't have access to ICTs, clinics that don't have computers or energy can use mobile phones to log the stock levels at clinics. And we were asked to, for instance, do an economic evaluation on this initiative to see did the supply chain resilience improve because of visibility. Of course, it's never that easy to say yes or no, but this is also an example where it's an inclusive innovation. It improves potentially access to healthcare, but it is not that easy to evaluate because it's very complex and it's part of a bigger program. And you're not going to just by looking at stock levels fix that much, but it's a contribution. Now, when people ask me, what are you doing in your program? I use this figure. So these different levels are different levels of analysis. I'm going to start on level 2 to explain what we're doing. So what we try to do in our program is we try to refine systems frameworks and see if we can develop analytical tools out of them. So what we use is an innovation system perspective, the value chain perspective, and the ecosystem perspective. And we want to create mechanisms or tools that we can look at the system and understand its dynamics. Then surely, if we can look at the system and understand its dynamics better, we can then start to see, let's say we implement a certain intervention. Can we see what outcomes have been achieved because of this? Is this mechanism working or not? So it enables us to start to look at, let's change something and see if it's working or not. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're doing around that, and I'm going to talk about some of that. Level 3 then is we use these frameworks to perform monitoring and evaluation studies. So we're better equipped to understand interventions. At the highest level, there's usually some policy learning, but it trickles down right to the bottom, where I worked for 3 years in the social sciences before I returned to engineering. And I was very happy to say that since I'm back in engineering, we also collaborate very frequently with projects that actually are innovations. But understanding the systems better and how they can change it helps also to design these interventions. So what we normally do then, project 3, 2, and 1, monitoring the analytical frameworks and then the development of innovation projects. But what I want to talk to you about today is the analytical frameworks, where we look at improving our lenses and then also use systems thinking to look at how we can model and use systems dynamics tools to understand the black box, or opening the black box of innovation. So the title of my talk is Opening the Black Box of Innovation. Now, why am I saying that, and why is it necessary? Now, if we go back about 100 years, macroeconomic development models could sufficiently explain growth in economies by using capital and labor, or as a function of capital and labor. And then there was growingly this residual, the models started to systematically not recreate the trend, which then prompts any model developer to think, okay, there could be an additional mechanism at play here that we are actually missing. And that is where they started to explore technological change as one of the explanations of driving macroeconomic development. But as you can see, this is a bit of a black box approach, because technological change was quickly regarded as something that is not just coming like manna from heaven. We have to endogenize this process in models to understand what exactly is driving technological change. We know that innovation is something that depends on huge investment over a long period of time and built up stocks of capabilities to be able to implement that. So that is where this call came already 50 years ago, 40 years ago, about it's necessary to open the black box of innovation and understanding how this process really works. It's a driver of growth, and innovation is important because it improves productivity. And if we improve productivity, we can raise the quality of life of people because they can earn higher incomes. So that's basically why we want to focus on innovation. But of course, this is not a linear process. So what we try to do in our program is then to look at the complexities and the feedback loops and the reinforcing behaviors that exist in innovation systems. Of course, the whole process of starting to unpack the black box we didn't start working on it yesterday. It was a very famous report by Vannevar Bush called Science, the Endless Frontier. He was commissioned to write that post-Second World War because everybody wanted to know all this investment in technology and in wartime technologies, how will it benefit society? And implicitly in his report, he started to refer to a linear model of innovation. Now, a linear model of innovation would be increased investment in research, it will lead to development, it will lead to products, it will go to market. very quickly people said, yeah, but it's not only a one-way flow. There's sometimes demand for products, and that triggers investment in research development. So there's a push and a pull dynamic. Now, I think it's unfair to call this a model. It's more like a heuristic. If you call it a heuristic, it helps to organize our thinking. It's not necessarily an explanation of the dynamics, but it helps us to start to organize our thinking. But it was obviously criticized for being linear. So then Klein and Rosenberg was one of the first people to start to say, okay, there's a lot of complexities, and I'm not going to present this in detail, but they highlighted a lot of feedback loops around knowledge and research and functions in the system. And they started to develop models that acknowledge the complexities of the innovation process. And then more recent generations are networking models. So it recognizes that there are multiple actors in systems. They interact, they develop, they build capacities, and there are a range of inputs and capabilities built up over time. Now, the tool that we frequently use to look at this is then system dynamics modeling. We do not always build fully blown models. I believe that the tools of systems thinking is sometimes enough to start to map the causal loop diagrams. So just to give you an idea here, this is actually the main feedback loops from my PhD thesis back in 2006. And it was my first attempt to develop a model of an innovation system. And basically I used the theory of Cohen and Leventhal. They say R&D has two phases. On the one hand, when you do R&D, you invest in capabilities to absorb knowledge. So you're creating knowledge on the one hand because you are discovering new ideas or developing new knowledge, but on the other hand, you are doing research on what's been done. And that is how you build up absorptive capacities. And these are elements that you need to be able to create a knowledge base. So I don't think I have to explain to you the methodology of system dynamics, but basically the modeling bit is then to build a stock and flow model, and it's basically to build a system of differential equations that will describe complex behaviors. Now, if we look at the innovation systems perspective, I just want to check time. So if we look at the innovation systems perspective, this is a very important part of our work, and this was developed in the 1980s, 90s by the OECD, specifically Freeman. And what they wanted to do was to explain why Japan was the most successful country post-Second World War. They were one of the losers, but they actually ended up being, well, they're not doing that well anymore, but at the stage they were actually doing incredibly well, and they couldn't understand what's happening there. So they developed the innovation systems perspective. It's not a theory, it is not a model, it's a framework. The difference between a model and a theory and a framework is models have causal attribution and is trying to explain things. Frameworks are conceptualizations of elements that could be at play when we look at something. So, of course, this is then where a lot of work has to happen. How do we use this framework to help explain or help unpack the black box or understand dynamics? Now, innovation systems have been applied on a number of levels. We've got the national level, which was some of the first applications. And if we look at the choice of systems boundary, that would be a nation, for instance, South Africa. If we look at the regional innovation system, the systems boundary then would be the Western Cape, for instance. I will allude to a program that we're working on at the moment where we are working with the Western Cape province to look at maturity of innovation systems. And in this case, we are using a regional unit of analysis. Then, of course, there's a sectoral innovation system, and that is specific to a sector, and it would be potentially focusing on green energy. Technological innovation systems, where a lot of innovation has been happening to understand innovation systems and the dynamics better, is something like electric cars. So you would focus on a technological innovation system, and that doesn't necessarily happen within the borders of a nation state or a region. It could be in global value chains. So you can imagine already when you start to try and think about modeling these things, the unit of analysis, the approach is quite important and must be selected appropriately. And national innovation systems could contain many regional innovation systems. Sectoral innovation systems could be across regional and national innovation systems. So, this gives us a sense of the different ways to apply the innovation system perspective. So what is the innovation system perspective? Now, the way that one can define a system is a system consists of components that condition and constrain each other towards a common goal or purpose. So that is the definition of a system, or that one we adopted. And the structural aspects of an innovation system can be defined as the actors. So these can be universities, companies, government, interactions. So many different actors interact towards performing certain functions. There's then the component of knowledge creation, creating innovations. Institutions is a very important focus of the work in innovation systems. Now, you find hard institutions and soft institutions. Hard institutions would be something like laws, regulations, standards. Soft institutions would be something like culture. A lot of work has been done, for instance, in Silicon Valley, and there's a huge focus on entrepreneurial culture and risk-taking, for instance, in those studies. And then there's infrastructure. Hard infrastructure would be roads, access to ICTs, the internet. Softer infrastructures would be spaces and places created for people to engage. Maybe a conference could count as a soft infrastructure element. But these different components interact and condition and constrain each other, and then they perform certain functions. So now we can start to think about the dynamics in the system in terms of functions. And the major functions are entrepreneurial activity, so new venture generation, presence of companies. We can talk about it in a minute in more detail. Knowledge development and learning, I think it's more self-explanatory. Diffusion of ideas, guidance of search. So the system may be guided by certain goals set by government or by industry partners. The creation of markets, so it's demand. The mobilization of resources. This is money, people, even knowledge, and then the creation of legitimacy. So to what extent do people adopt or understand the specific technology as a legitimate solution to their problems or to implement? For instance, wind and solar has gained enormous legitimacy since it's become more economical to implement. Now, every time I sit down and talk, especially to government actors, I always say, but what can we do about innovation? It's never quite clear what the different actors can do to help support this. Now, there's the traditional market failure argument where we look at the system as a market, but then, of course, there's the systems failure argument, which is based on evolutionary economics, and it's all about the idea of institutional design. So the kinds of policies that we would look at in a market failure space would be the lack of incentives to invest. But in a systems failure argument, we would look like capabilities. How do we create infrastructure? How do we facilitate more collaborations between actors? How do we distribute and develop knowledge and insights about products? And what are the kinds of capabilities that we must develop? And this, of course, is still very abstract. So we started to think about these interventions. And if you want to start to open a black box, you need sort of a paradigm around how you believe interventions work. And Paulson and Tilly made a fantastic contribution to the theory of the monitoring and evaluation of interventions. And it's called realist evaluation. So they acknowledge that different actors, people are different. The way that interventions are implemented will affect people differently. There's no such thing as, does this program work? The question is, what works, for whom, under what circumstances, in what respects, and why? So the of course, we want macro models to create mid-range theories of interventions like, does street lighting work to reduce crime? We want to answer that question. But with realist evaluation, we try to understand the intervention. We don't try to generalize. We want to understand better. We understand the guts of the dynamics of this. And the main components of this is that we recognize there's a context. There are certain measures that will be mechanisms through which it's implemented, and certain outcomes are then achieved. So programs are theories in action. It is designed by people who want to change a system, and then it's implemented, but it's a theory in action. Now, I wanted to definitely share a few examples of our work and how we have moved through a different range of stages of using the innovation system perspective, using systems thinking and trying to move towards a space where we can model it or explain it. But the focus is more on explaining. So one of the first big case studies that we started to analyze is the Mom Connect program. So my student, Edward van der Merwe, in 2018, I think it's then when he completed his master's. But the Mom Connect project is one of the only ICT for development programs in South Africa that's scaled at that stage. It was scaled because the Department of Health decided they want to implement it. And what this program was about was for women that are pregnant to register on the system, and they would go to a clinic and they would be encouraged to register on the system. And the main intervention initially, it's a very simple intervention, is to furnish them with information twice a week during the different stages of pregnancy until the baby is 1 year old, and to give them useful information. Later on, they circled back to receive information from mothers around the experiences at clinics, and also if they had complaints or compliments. And that information was then taken to different decision makers within the Department of Health. So what we did was then to try and project our framework onto this theory of change. So what we did was we mapped the theory of change of the Mom Connect program, and then we tried to see if we can sort of identify a few of these dynamics that can sort of indicate the different functions that we have in an innovation system. For instance, there was a knowledge development and diffusion aspect. So the mothers had to get knowledge of the intervention. They needed to be provided knowledge about the pregnancy. So that's a development and diffusion process. And we just started to play around a little bit with parts of this model, trying to explain or recreate some of these behaviors. But to be honest, this was very unsatisfactory, because to me, the whole point is we want to develop frameworks using the innovation system perspective to explain. So what we're doing here is we take a program theory and we project it on top of it. That's not what we want to do. So we decided that we'll have to go and create empirical base for this. We need to go and build databases of innovations, how they take place and how they've been implemented. And what we then started to do is to use event history analysis. Now, what this means, and it's incredibly hard work, but that's why you have masters and PhD students. And what we had to do is we built a database of events. Of course, there are so many methodological things to think about here, but in principle, we build a database of important events of how a specific innovation unfolds. Then what we did was we started to map these events to functions. So what functions are at play during some of these events? And for that, we created a list of indicators for each function, so that we have a process that can be recreated by somebody else and hopefully come up with a similar solution. And then what we do is we use these databases to start to look for trends. and trend patterns, interaction patterns and episodes. Now, a trend pattern would be to show trends in the evolution of the program over time. An aggregated trend pattern is the accumulation of events over time. And what we try to do is, if an event had a positive effect on a function, we would, at this stage, is +1, and if it's negative, it's -1. I mean, we can refine this still a lot, but the idea is to build a database. And then the other very challenging part of this is to develop interaction patterns. So how can we use this event database to start to understand how different functions and actors interact during certain events? And we keep on refining and refining and refining. So this is an example of one of the first ones. This was on the unit of analysis of a project. So it was quite simple. We looked at the Mafara project. And that was, I still have about 25 minutes, at 15 minutes. Perfect. Okay, so this was the Mafara project. And as with any person who wants to test a method, the case is not quite as important as testing the method. And the project was about helping elderly rural women in the Mafara area to learn to use computers and to see if that can help improve their farming or the gardens that they maintain, vegetable gardens, and a range of other health issues they might have. So whether this is scalable or not is a completely different question, but we wanted to see, can we use this to map the events? And of course, we could then distinguish but certain episodes in this intervention from where the CSIR who implemented it do literature reviews, study these different interventions, what could work, engaging with the community leaders, getting legitimacy for this by getting approval for this intervention to be implemented there, then having a host and range of workshops and visits and things like that. And the important bit is, why are we doing this? We want to start to understand how these functions happened over time, how they interacted. So the interaction patterns are quite important for us. And we have to continuously evolve this method. So, of course, if we use a project as a unit of analysis, you can just go and throw everything in one big pot. But if you start to look at it on an industry level or something that's a little bit more complicated, we now have to not only map functions and events, we need to look at which actors are involved at what stage, and in the functions, even what their roles are. Are they performing? Are they giving? Are they receiving? So we refine it every time we start to build more of these event databases. And we try to find ways to visualize this. This is an aggregated trend pattern. It was for the Mafara case. So what it helps to do is also to see how can we over time see what functions are important and how they changed over time. Now we are building this is a complicated slide to present. Let me just skip over it. But what we've done now, what we've done now is Michelle McClelland has now, with her PhD, developed 3 case studies of companies and 1 industry level case study using this methodology. But we also created a framework of how we integrate event history analysis with the process of analyzing innovation systems integrated with a realist evaluation perspective. So we have a process of considering the context, the intervention, the mechanisms through which these functions create impacts, and then the certain outcomes. So now we have a tool that we can use again and again to build a database of these interventions. So what are we doing? I have now a PhD student who's based in Nigeria, and he built a database of the electronic wallet for farmers system. Michelle McClelland's PhD built 3 company-level case studies and a sector-level case study. I've got a student, Bernie Marshall, who was the first person to implement it. He created 3 of these databases for innovation for inclusive development. I've got a student, Maraki Mathieu. She's going to build 3 of them for education innovations. And then I've got a new student who's going to do it in tourism. She is a sector development specialist in Mpumalanga, and she's going to focus on creating or innovative process or sector level process around stimulating innovation in products or tourism experiences co-created with local communities. Now, where I need help from the OR community is every time we submit an article to any kind of journal that's not the innovation systems or innovation studies journal, they tell us, but how do you get to those CLDs? I mean, well, it's through interpretation and inspection, and a lot of reviewers accept that in certain parts. But what we now have is we have a temporal network of different actors performing different functions over time. And I've got a student who started to dabble a little bit in doing temporal network analysis and to see if we can start to look at clusters of episodes and where we can see certain kinds of interventions and or actually activities between certain actors at times with specific roles. Can't we start to analyze these databases that we are painstakingly building to see if we can make sense out of it in another way that's a little bit more scientific potentially to look at the CLDs? So that is one proposal I've got. Then we have a program with Czech, collaborating with colleagues at the Western Cape, University of the Western Cape. And the one thing about sectors, because we take a regional and sectoral perspective, is that industries industries go through different levels of maturity. So if you take wind, initially it was not necessarily economically viable to implement wind on a large scale for many reasons. Apart from not be able to be a baseload option, it was also far more expensive than coal. But as development continued, the generation capacity of wind improved. And then the industry went into maturity. But like any industry, things go into decline. If you just think about film cameras, for instance. So the innovation system and the different aspects, let's say, of entrepreneurial activity is not the same during different phases. Early stage, there would be very few companies doing it because it's still a technology being developed. The moment it becomes economically feasible, more participants join the system. And as competition on price increases, there's consolidation in the market, like the car manufacturers. There are only a few left. And then eventually in decline, there's a new technology, maybe like electric vehicles, not combustion engines. So we have now qualitatively developed at first a way to look at different levels of maturity for different functions, having unpacked it into different dimensions. But the project that we are working on currently is to start to build an environment where we can capture spatial data for some of these indicators. At first, just to get an idea about the sectors. So can we map actors? That's quite simple. Can we map my project that I'm driving with this person called Nicole Nell is to look at agro-processing. So there could be, for instance, extension initiatives that they also capture on a spatial level. So we want to look at, can we build layers of different aspects of these functions of the innovation system that we can create eventually an environment where we can start to model. But there we need statisticians and people who can do that kind of work. So if anybody is interested to collaborate or talk, it would be amazing. So I think, is it okay if I finish now? It's actually in time. So one last little snippet of an invitation is that we are launching a new focus as well in our program. It is called the Access to Food Project. And initially, we want to look at the dynamics of wholesale markets in terms of helping upcoming farmers to find access to markets, but it's also a very good mechanism to give people access to services. And what we want to do is to look at the role of technology in there. But of course, there's an enormous opportunity here for all kinds of modeling studies around agro-processing or food systems. And I think the OR community will be able to also maybe contribute in our program that we want to kickstart now. And yeah, I think in a closing remark, just from my presentation, I want to say that whether we take a micro view, a macro view, or meso view, whether we have a black box perspective or we try to unpack and look into the black box, I think there's space for all these studies, because not one of these perspectives will give you a complete answer. But I think it's important that we share these things, and I think it's fantastic to have this kind of platform to be able to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for a fantastic presentation. Yeah, just so much food for thought, and fantastic cross-disciplinary seed information there. So the floor is open for questions and response to the challenges that Sarah has thrown out.
Thanks. It was a great talk. There's a huge amount of information there, so it's quite difficult to take it all in. When you're doing these really sort of complex projects and you're modeling them with all these dynamics, do you also consider sort of adversarial actors? Because there might be people that are intentionally pushing this information into the system or doing something to disrupt some domain in order for their benefit. Is that something that you would also consider?
It's something we should consider. So we do try to map negative functions. For instance, if something happened and there's a breach of trust, you know, it can happen in projects. We don't necessarily always include everybody that could be involved. So I think the challenge with this is it's a system of a system of a system. And the system boundary, like with any study, is a choice you have to make. But it's a good suggestion, because I think it could be maybe a case study on or event history analysis on the effect of this. But I do think it's important also that we don't necessarily trying to generalize in the studies. We want to look exactly for examples of where things happened. And that can be a fantastic objective or focus of on these case studies. Thanks for that suggestion.
Thanks. Further questions or comments?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I found it a very interesting, very insightful presentation. To your point about modeling networks over time, I wonder whether you've considered looking into the social networks community, because I'm aware that there's a lot of work being done that seems related, also in terms of modeling change of social networks over time and decisions that are made in different policy arenas. And I wondered whether that could be something that you have considered or not, or that you might consider in the future.
Yeah, I think I personally try to stick to my knitting, which is definitely not that. But I do have a postdoc in my team who is specializing on network analysis. And yeah, she, you know, I don't always know what she's doing, but she's doing a range of projects where we take a network perspective. So this is sort of new ideas and things, but I definitely think that is exactly the call for help, actually, that we definitely need to collaborate with people who do already have those skills. It's something that's a specialist area.
Thanks. There were some other hands up. Were there? Okay, just a query from my side. You mentioned the Mom Connect project, and there were a number of ICT for development initiatives, I think. Was that the only one that actually was taken up sort of at any sort of scale?
Well, at the time, it was one of the prominent ones, and the big reason was that the Minister of Health decided that they had a KPI that they needed to meet, and it was quickly rolled out. So, you know, political will for these large-scale rollouts is usually one of the big drivers. So there are other projects that scaled, but this one was very well documented. And since we didn't necessarily focus so much on writing up the case study and more on trying to see if we can explain things around using the functions, that was the choice. And also we looked at it from different angles in my group. Because if you have a well-written up case study, we can apply ecosystems, we can apply value chains, we can apply innovation systems. But there are other projects that scale. Stock visibility solution is one of them. That scaled to 3,000 clinics.
One more question from my side. The Conjani clinics, what was the funding model for that?
Well, they have grant funding to set it up, but then the nurse has to sort of pay every month so it's like a mortgage on a clinic over a period of 5 years, and then she owns it. So yeah, the model is that it has to be a running concern that generates income, and then eventually she owns it. And that is why it is going to be sustainable, or hopefully will be sustainable. We have a range of projects with them on scaling. The one is just like a canvas aspect of how do you consider different dimensions of scaling. It's not necessarily only a location. It's also maybe new product services within clinics or new models to do outreach from a clinic. But we do actually have a student who has a more OR angle on it, and I'm collaborating with Jacomine Grobler on it, is to look at where should other clinics be placed. Because at the moment, they use their own insight, wisdom, and intuition to decide where to place clinics. But we're going to try and help them find a way to understand the features of where to place clinics. And that is where collaboration with OR people is really useful.
Yeah, that sounds a classic OR project.
So I'll ask the question first, and then I'll explain why I'm asking the question. How do you reach out to people in the community who have technical ability? So that comes from, I've met a few people from rural areas who are doing software projects to develop their community. One guy I was chatting to was basically on helping farmers get their product to market, and he was trying to set up in his back home. I think he was in I think it was Ghana. About, you know, he's come to South Africa, he's developed his skills, but he's still got his connection to his rural community, and he's got that insight and, you know, that way to do things and what the community needs. How do you reach out to those people? Because I'm sure there are a lot of kids who are now technically savvy, who are coming from rural communities, who are now all over the world, and who can contribute to things like this. I was just thinking, there's a pool of them, which I think, how do you actually get to them? How can you find them?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think if we had the answer to that, we would have fewer problems in the world. But typically, when these initiatives are developed, it's a pilot scale. So somebody will go and implement it, a specific case of it, and it can very well be in a community. And it's important to have co-creation processes, so that's really realistic. There's this term called parachuting in, when people from outside think, oh, we've got the solution, and we come and give it to you, and then it's really not it. An example that's actually one of the first examples that made me, the penny drop for me, was people discussed at a forum cooking solutions, because at taxi ranks there are many people cooking, and sometimes the materials that they use to cook food could be treated with all kinds of, like if it's building material to make fire, there's all kinds of that dangerous gases that will come from it. But if you want to go and change that, you think, let's give them a cheaper way to cook food. But actually what's happening there is a social system, an informal system that has a way of working. There are possibly people supplying the fuel, and there are people cooking. So what we're seeing is not people cooking. It's a system of where people get access to food in a specific way. And I think for people with solutions to really be sensitive to that is very important. And that is why these things don't scale. The more complicated an intervention, the smaller the chance it will scale. The more simple it is, the bigger the chance it will scale. Let's say people to dental hygiene. You can put fluoride in the water, it will work for everybody, but if you try to teach everybody to brush their teeth twice a day, it's far more difficult. So there are very few interventions that will be a silver bullet, maybe one or two, but most of the time it's a systems intervention that's required. And to really change big systems it actually never happens. It does not happen, and that's why we're studying it. Scaling is, they call it pilotitis. But it's always in pilot phase, and then it doesn't want to scale. And it's because, especially when you implement an initiative, all this attention, let's take the Mafara case. There's a lot of CSIR people coming there. There's food shared. People come, they call it eat and run. You know, people come and eat, and then they talk, and they say nice things about the innovation, and you write it up, and it's in your report. But you're not going to just put it down somewhere else and get the same result, because there's an enormous amount of investment by the people implementing the intervention where it's happening. So yeah, that's why these simple things scale, but complicated things don't really scale.
Thanks, Sarah. We've got time for one or two more questions. Okay, so I'm sure there are lots of things brewing in people's mind, and maybe there'll be time over lunch for further discussion.
Especially network people and people with, and statisticians, you know, those people. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, so the final part of wrapping up our conference, I'm going to hand over to the President, David Clark, to do the closing speeches.
Just keeping you all in suspense. So I know I stand between you and lunch. Great. Thanks, everyone. This has been a really fantastic conference. And it's gone by really quickly. I think you remember these four friends from the start. I'm not going to spend too long, so you'll get to lunch really quickly. So hopefully now you have a few more tools to change some of those faces to more smiley faces. We're never going to change everyone, right? But then we need to still have diversity. So we don't really want to change everyone, but we do want to have a few more. So, and I think all the talks have been fantastic. I hope everyone's got new ideas about how they can talk to their friends or to talk to their colleagues about what operations research is and what all the other disciplines do that sort of support the field. So as the conference wraps up, I just thought a couple of things in order to help people keep in touch if they want. So we do run meetups more or less every 2 weeks. They're very short. They're about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on when we hold them. They're currently virtual. They were set up on meetup.com, and they're open to anyone. So if you are interested, search for it. It's called Lean Analytics ORSSA. It's a bit tricky to search for because Meetup hasn't worked out that people are now virtual and can be anywhere in the world. So it still sort of thinks you have to be in Joburg to find it. But it's like I say, it's all virtual, so it doesn't matter where you are. So, and anyone's welcome to join us, and they're very lightweight, informal discussions. You can talk about anything. The other thing we have is a Discord channel, which is also open to anyone. There are a couple of member-only channels, but in general, we post a lot of things there. Maybe I post a lot of things there, and other people read it. But yeah, it's another place where you can reach out, especially to members of the Exco or to myself or to other people in operations research. And it's just there if you want to talk. Some other events that I feel are really useful to know about at the moment are Eventbrite has Euro's Practitioners Forum. They've throughout the last 2 years have been hosting virtual events. They're really worth attending. They have some really good speakers, and again, it's all virtual and it's free. And then UCT Statistical Science Department, Georgina is hosting a little mini OR symposium. Like I think, I assume this is still correct, but it's on the 19th of September. So the stats seminar group have had these virtual seminars also for the last 2 years. They've been really fun to attend if you could. And I don't know how long they're going to be available for, still virtually. So while they are, I think they're great things to support. There's lots of people to thank. So I'm going to do it really quickly because Neil did a great job thanking everyone and making us drink last night. So to the plenary speakers, you guys had fantastic and inspiring talks. Also our tutorial presentations were great. And to all the speakers, I think everyone did a great job and it was really fun to see what everyone's doing. And then to everyone else who just supported the conference, like I've said before, it's really important that your support matters a lot, basically. So to our sponsors who have really helped us, and then to the review panels and the judges who often have to spend many hours working through papers in order to decide who's going to be awarded what. And to my team on the Exco, you guys have done a great job. Thanks. And finally, there are some people who have really had an impact on every talk, and they are the audiovisual guys. So thanks. And before I go on to the next slide, well, I'll do one more slide, which is finally thanks to the Statistical Science Department at UCT. Thanks for hosting this conference. It's really been fantastic. The venue's been fantastic and a great job. So I want to just let Leanne come and thank her LOC. So Leanne, do you want to have a few words?
I have to just do one correction quickly. It is statistical sciences because it includes OR as well. Okay, so just a very quick thank you on my part to all my colleagues who helped organize this conference, to Beverly. I'm not sure if she's here, but she did fantastic support with was just doing all the admin in the background, and she's been sitting at registration every day of the conference, which has been brilliant. To Theo for putting the program together, thank you very much. To Ian, who did all the typesetting of the program, he did a fantastic job there. For Neil, for being a fabulous photographer / MC. And to Georgina for supporting at the tutorials and for being here. Thanks very much, everyone.
Sorry about the sciences. Yes, plurals do matter sometimes. And yes, as Ian said, a very big thanks to the LOC and to the chair of the ORSSA2022 conference, and that's to Leanne Scott. Thanks so much. You've done a great job, and you've been super reliable and super committed, and it was been a pleasure working with your team, and I think that's largely to you. So thanks very much, Leanne. We do have something we would like to give you. So. Thank you. And yeah, now everyone can go to lunch. We look forward to seeing you all again at ORSSA 2023. Thanks, everyone.